The Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Welcome to today's Provoke Media Podcast. I'm Megan Miller, Head of Content Partnerships at Provoke, and the host of today's episode. Today, we bring you a conversation with Red Havas, exploring the evolution of purpose in 2022. With us today, we have Anne Tyrer, Vice President, U.K. Corporate Affairs and Communications with American Express, and James Wright, CEO of Red Havas Group and Global Chairman of Havas PR Corporate Global Collective. Anne, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. It's great to be here. I've been in the PR industry probably more years than I'd like to admit, but I've been with American Express for the past 8 years. I originally joined working for Small Business Sector Day and Shop Small campaigns for the business, which in the UK actually we're now entering our 10th year, and I'd say those campaigns are as relevant and as important as they were, when they were founded. And my remit in the UK includes corporate sustainability. And I think given, American Express's commitments and progress in this area, it's something that I am passionate about, lending the company's voice to this important conversation.
Thank you. And James, if you want to go into a little bit about Red Havas's role in this conversation and starting the conversation about purpose in 2022 and the 3 Ps that you've done some white paper work on, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. So at Red Havas, we operate all around the world, 14 markets, 22 offices, and we obviously work with lots of different types of clients, whether it's tech companies, corporate B2B companies, governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, lifestyle brands, startups, scale-ups, the lot. So we've seen a lot of shifting in the concept of purpose. If you like, purpose has been disrupted in the last 2 years. I guess the pandemic has lifted the lid on that. You talked about our 3 Ps, which are, the pandemic, polarizing politics and protests that we've seen, particularly in the US, but all around the world, we've seen this. And that really, I guess, has shifted the dial on the expectation around purpose. We always talk at Red Havas that purpose is what you do, not what you say. And so actually, we wrote a white paper that was from Pledges to Progress, which has also been updated a couple of times, but that's to look at how just pledging to do something isn't enough anymore. The expectation is that you actually are showcasing progress in that space. You've got a lot of big questions being asked of corporate's progress now, scrutiny from journalists, from shareholders, from obviously consumers and customers. But I think the big factor here as well in the last couple of years has been the employee. And we wrote another white paper on the rise of the employee. And particularly the voice of the employee, which had become a big factor now. I guess, that kind of pyramid of authority has kind of been flipped, with employees now taking a much stronger interest in how an organization operates and their expectation of that organization's role in society and actually benefiting the communities in which it operates has gone on to a new level. And it's always been there in the last sort of 10, 20 years, but this last couple of years, it's really shifted to a new dimension.
Thank you so much. So in today's episode, we're going to explore what it means to be authentic, as James has illuminated to us, in a brand's communications relating to purpose, including that pertaining to ESG themes and topics, the importance of alignment horizontally and vertically across the organization, as well as the increasing importance of purpose on employee engagement, retention, and talent attraction. So James, you kind of have introduced some of these subjects already, and I'm curious if you can introduce to us what it was about the 3 Ps, what they are, how you came up with them, as they're really kind of foundational to how we talk about purpose for the sake of this conversation.
Well, in PR, we love alliteration. So, when we were talking about purpose and then we're going into politics, protests and pandemic, kind of sat pretty well with, for the first 18 to sort of, I guess, 24 months, over the last 18 to 24 months, that's really been dominating the news. Obviously now got a war in the Ukraine, which is kind of a new facet to that, but you could describe that under polarized politics. But we do a meaningful brand study at Havas, and we've been tracking brands for 12 years, and that surveys over 400,000 people around the world each year, and it's in the last year or so has marked a shift in how consumers really view the role of business when it comes to how they operate in the world. They want to see and they prefer purpose-driven brands, and some 73% in the whole global study believe brands should act now for the good of society and the communities in which they operate. And if they don't, then consumers will hold them account to it. I mean, I think the bar has been officially raised over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of talk of CSR and ESG commitments, and they've been abundant for a long, long time. But I think the other part of this is that it used to be a tick box exercise. Big companies would produce CSR reports, ESG reports, sustainability reports, and they'd look really at kind of a checklist of things that they wanted to be able to do to be able to prove that they were improving whether it was their environmental footprint, the impact that they had on the communities, or indeed actually driving greater benefits and governance into their business, so they were operating fairly and appropriately. But that kind of tunnel vision, I guess, on that checklist has really become much more lateral and looking at it in a much bigger way of that commitment. And that's where I think things has shifted. I mean, ESG, I remember a very prominent commentator in the Financial Times turned the ESG kind of commitment acronym into eye roll, sigh, and groan due to the vast number of businesses painting rosy pictures about their brands and their industries through wonderful reports and initiatives. But stakeholders have woken up to that in the last couple of years, and as I say, I think that bar really has been officially raised.
And this is all a space that Amex knows very well. Long before this moment of the 3 Ps, I think Amex has really been doing this as a real thought leader and kind of a trailblazer, if you will, in this space, whether it be the Shop Small initiatives or some of your approach to purpose-driven initiatives within your internal aspects. What is it that makes Amex unique from other brands in how it's approaching that purpose-led initiatives? Kind of like what are your core values or initiatives that are really driving that, and what have been those initiatives that have carried you to today?
So I guess first of all, I'll challenge like how unique we are. I mean, simply because that putting it forward, all purpose at the heart of your business is the right thing to do, absolutely. And, as James mentioned, consumers, customers, they're telling business. It's what the message is really loud and clear. And when we look at the collective responsibility that's going to be required, that's public, private sector, and society, is a role we all got to play. So, I hope we also don't think that we're that unique. And also, the business case, it's absolutely there, but, sustainable business and profitable business are absolutely compatible. So, it's great to see the increased debate and conversation in this area and things forward. From an Amex point of view, I think supporting the communities where we work is absolutely, it's a core central value. We've got that history of, employee volunteerism, grant giving, and CSR initiatives. It is very much kind of embedded culture. We actually started out 17 years ago as a freight forwarding business, helping people get their precious cargo from A to B. So the trust was always kind of, central to our business, and, that's continued. It moved forward to, present day. And, last year, we published our, first ESG strategy report. It's, we wanted to, it always been important to us, but we wanted to put the stake in the ground and look at, how our business could address some of the biggest kind of global challenges that are out there and be held to account on it and actually, demonstrate the investment we're putting behind it. And, in the last 2 years alone, committed, over $2 billion to ESG.
Thank you, Anne. So many good points there. Curious, James, how is this tracking with what you are hearing from other clients in the space? Is this, are these trends the same trends we're seeing right now? Is it the same driving forces, or are we seeing really new initiatives that are pushing these 3Ps and this commitment to purpose?
I think there's, for us, been a number of clear areas that have come into sharp focus for purpose. The first is around well-being of employees. And I think, health and well-being of employees has never been as paramount as it is today. It's on the agenda of boardrooms. It's questions that are being asked by shareholders because, and particularly this, was at the beginning of the pandemic. How are you going to keep the wheels turning? How are you going to keep the business going? So actually that whole piece around the well-being of employees was a real focus for every single organization, whether you were on the front line or whether it was in the office. And I think that the provision for flexible working, the bigger focus on mental health and mental fitness. We've seen much bigger budgets now come in around employee engagement, the development of benefits and the likes to be able to tackle the great resignation. And again, I think that's been a huge shift as well for businesses. So that's been a clear area for us around well-being of employees. The second has been around equal justice or equity and inclusion, to illuminate your current status, to openly talk about steps you're taking to improve. I mean, equity is defined as the state, quality, or ideal, or being just, impartial, and fair. And that is the absolute expectation, I think, for business today. Everything that followed from the George Floyd murder that, has come to a head from a lot of similar situations that have happened, in particular in the US in the years that preceded it, all the way through later that year to, the focus on Asian hate, and then, the whole equity shift. And I think also this shift from being an ally to being an active ally. And what do I mean by that is that a lot of organizations would stand on the sideline and say that they supported a lot of these initiatives, and active allies actually injecting themselves and actually having an opinion and doing something about it with programs and initiatives that have outcomes. And then the third sort of area after well-being of employees, equal justice, is climate change. And far from falling off the agenda during the pandemic, there's been a considerable focus on climate change too. And that has become a tentpole of action as well, and not just from organizations, but governments too. And, frankly, all of this can't be done unless our sort of governmental systems and healthcare systems and education systems work, in partnership with brands and organizations and NGOs. And so the message is clear for us. There's a lot of recognition around purpose, but that recognition now needs to deliver results.
Certainly. And Anne, as we kind of introduce some of these very poignant moments in this past year, how has that shifted kind of the approach or the conversation internally at Amex? That you have this strong background and history of being purpose driven. Obviously, there's probably been some change, and there's been some need to evolve with that. And I'm really interested in hearing more about how those conversations have been impacted for you.
Yeah, sure. And I think what was interesting and hearing James speak is that it just, it reminds you how enormous this topic is, and all the different areas that it touches, across all stakeholders. Obviously your colleagues are incredible. You need to be listening to them kind of throughout this, but all your other stakeholders, and certainly, we're hearing it, from customers, you hear it from regulators, you hear it from the media. So you have to think about how you're going to be intentional and the way you've got a role to play. So what is going to be authentic to your business and your values that is also going to deliver for all your different stakeholders. And so, the ESG strategy that I mentioned earlier, I mean, that was a 2-year journey for us, really getting to that we over filtered stakeholders, try to understand, the critical issues for our colleagues or community, and then understanding where our sweet spot was going to be, where we could really create meaningful impact. And so, James alluded to it. I mean, where it took us to is we created, 3 pillars that we said, under these pillars, this is where we're going to act. So ours were, promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, advancing climate solutions, and building financial confidence. So that kind of gives us the framework where we're going to act. And we also rely on to give it to that structure as well.
Sure. What does
but actually,
go ahead.
So sorry, I think the only thing I was going to add is that, creating a framework or in our instance, having 3 pillars, I think it's important to say that doesn't need to limit your ambition or your impact. That I think, it provides, focus and clarity, but it shouldn't be like narrowing limits. I mentioned Saturday earlier, and just as an indication, I think that campaign's relevant as it, if not more so than it ever was. And, we're intending to drive an additional 100 billion spend at small businesses by, 2012. So I think it's really important to think about, sorry, I'm lost you.
We can still see you, but I can.
Oh, okay.
I actually have a question for James here on that subject of, Anne's talking about these sort of guides or frameworks that they keep a finger on the pulse of what's to come and preparing for these, shifts again. And I'm interested in hearing more about, we've covered a lot about what has happened, but as we look to the future, what are some really tangible ways that you are either seeing other brands keep their finger on this pulse or take the same kind of approach that Anne is talking about and applying that towards how they monitor this and prepare in advance for things to come?
Yeah, I think Anne makes some great points there. And obviously Amex has got a great history in this and continues to sort of set the bar, if you like, in that kind of in their industry. But it's there's some sort of basics to it, which is, you need to be able to measure what you're doing and then be able to see, as I said to you before, like the progress, the tangible progress, that's being made. There's been a lot of research surveys, speaking to stakeholders across, your own organization more so than ever nowadays. And in particular, I think, talking to employees and future and potential employees around what it is that you should be focusing your energy on beyond just the core products and service. I mean, it's great that also some of those products and services are also evolving to meet, more diverse groups. And I think, there's been a discussion around how, ESG should be adding a H to it and talk about health. I mean, you could argue that it's encapsulated in other parts of ESG, but actually focusing specifically on health is interesting, which actually then opens up another kind of lead, I guess, that's also being revealed during the pandemic, and that's of health equity, ensuring that actually everybody has fair access to essential health services, which, particularly, I think raised everybody's literacy in health up a little bit because they started to understand a lot more about their own health and health of their friends and their family, because it was, it was the primary topic of conversation for a long time. And then when we had this kind of situation where we were accelerating towards a vaccine, how do we actually better understand how that vaccine was made? And then it opened the conversation up around, clinical trials. How are we approaching clinical trials? Are we actually going to diverse groups, ensuring that they're fairly represented when we are doing those clinical trials? Because actually then, you saw that vaccines impact on certain more diverse groups, or, particularly around, the side effects of the vaccines were more prominent in certain areas, as well as actually just understanding COVID-19 and how that was impacting certain groups more than others, and why was that? So in what role can we play as organizations in that to be able to support, creating greater equity from a health perspective? I actually just think the whole situation right now, though, is extremely complex for businesses, because there's almost an expectation that you have a point of view on everything. And I think, being a CEO today is never been trickier. I'm based here in New York, and, almost all organizations are being asked for their point of view on abortion, on climate change, on, equity and equal justice. And is it right to wade into those? If you're not a political organization, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I think it's for you to reach back into your values and your purpose and the expectations of your stakeholders as to whether you should or not. But I think, there is definitely now a much more adventure in wanting to actually talk about those in a more active way, in the same way I was mentioning that difference between being an ally and an active ally.
And Anne, for you at Amex, is this, James has brought up a lot of big issues and big topics. And when you look to that meter for the future, sort of, is there a way that you weigh internally whether something is what you weigh in on or not, or what are some of those internal conversations driven by as to whether or not it's a place you want to put a stake in the sand?
Yeah, I think it's, it's an evolving conversation, isn't it? That, it's important to have your framework, to have your vision and your principles, and that you better, drive the conversation on whether it's just 3 areas or whatever it is. I think that's helpful, but you have to keep listening. This is going to evolve. It's not going to be a static thing. That conversation will change and move forward. And even, we saw, lots of companies have talked about their flexible working model, since the pandemic. And, certainly the model that we've had, early into the pandemic was thinking about what our return looked like. It was different to what we actually returned with. It was quite different. Yeah. And, that was essential because, you were listening to colleagues and it needed to evolve. And, going forward, we're all living it now, trialing it. Doesn't mean that it will stay this way either. I think, I think you have to stay open, you have to stay agile, but while still being kind of authentic to what your core values are and what's meaningful, for your business and stakeholders.
Absolutely. And James, we've talked really a lot of high level perspective on this, but really tangible ways that businesses can apply these things or listen. I guess we're all aware of issues that are a part of our daily news diet. And how do you sort of filter that bias of what people are consuming who are in these leadership capacities, to also be in touch with what your audience or your true consumer base is interested in? Have you seen any really interesting ways that people are keeping their finger on the pulse very closely to what their consumers are interested in?
Yes, I think that, I mentioned before, there's a lot of research and surveys that are happening at a much greater level. And as I said, the employee base is a very important factor in that, and learning from them, because they're also probably your consumers. Yeah. They should be your greatest ambassadors. And so, there's nothing particularly kind of, I think, groundbreaking about it. This is just about listening and then acting as opposed to just listening. So, that's what we've seen the organizations and clients that we work with that have done it very well in terms of actually understanding what their consumers want, what their employees want, what their stakeholders want, actually just learning from that and then acting in a much faster way. And I think, kind of, it's also been okay as well. I think, this sort of, it's been okay for C-suite people, CEOs, to say that they don't have all the answers as well, which, has actually built trust with employees and consumers too. As CEOs, I'm a CEO, you're hardwired to have all of the answers all the time. And actually, I think there's been this much more empathetic way of approaching that, was to say, look, well, I don't have all the answers right now, but I'm working really hard to find those answers for you. And, we're doubling down, we're tripling down to find those answers, and, actually sort of over communicating to people about, what you're doing to be able to, whether that's keep your products and services going during the pandemic and make it safe, and move from a, I guess, COVID safe situation to a COVID confident situation for consumers and for employees, as well as actually going, look, we want to play a role in equal justice. We want to play a role in supporting equity in our organization and in the communities in which we operate. We need to work out exactly what the best way for us to do that is, so that we can have the biggest and greatest impact. And I do think, that whole piece around using your own strategic and technical capability in your industry and with the brands that you have to be able to shift, the needle on some of these, big issues and smaller issues as well. I mean, look at some of the work that Amex are doing it with, with small business, that's big for those small businesses, right? But actually, and then collectively, it becomes an even bigger piece. But, it's small or bigger initiatives, they all add up, and, there's still a long journey to go on. And, this is, I think, really, we're still at the very sort of beginning, I think, of really understanding what, where this is going to head to. And if one thing that the last 18 months, 2 years has told us that, no one can predict the future. It's not like everyone's producing 5 and 10 year business plans anymore. It's kind of like you might have a broad plan in 5 years, but really you're sticking to a 2 or 3 year plan just to be able to get to that point. And it kind of is almost like an evolving plan that's rolling every 3 or 4 months that you update, because so much is changing. And just to come back to your question, that's because they're listening and seeing what's happening. And again, it is being affected by polarizing politics. It is being affected by, the starts and false starts we get with the pandemic. And it is being affected by people that are more actively wanting to protest about issues that matter. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as we wrap up this very big conversation, which we've scratched the surface on today, and I just am very interested to hear from you as part of this legacy brand that has been doing this and been working towards getting fit for purpose for so many years before this conversation even really started. Any learnings or advice that you have for other brands as they begin to engage in public dialogue around societal issues, whether that's avoiding the allegations of cause washing, woke washing, greenwashing, all that, how you've navigated it well, and what advice you have. Yeah.
I think there's probably a couple of things. I think know thyself, really understand your business, its values, and how your business, impacts and interacts with all your stakeholders. You've got to be authentic, to your values, and you need to find that sweet spot that addresses, it might be competing interests of stakeholders, but there will be a sweet spot in there. I think, James touched on it as well. This kind of actions, not just pledges. I mean, pledges and commitments, of course, they're really important, but, people want to see tangible examples and progress. And, for us as communicators, I think it also adds to the storytelling and kind of I think it helps take your brand forward if you can really paint a picture of what you're doing. And then the final thing I'd say is really about benchmarks, that, you need to be able to kind of benchmark where you are. I mean, it might be, look at your peers, look at credible third parties, see what they're doing. And, you may not be at the point of having an ESG strategy, but that can be a good place to start in how you want to hold yourself to account to make sure you're making progress in, in good increments. So, and link to that on the benchmarks, I think is kind of transparency, make what you're going to do, be open about it, and really help drive that conversation forward. Play it a role in it's, arguably one of the most important conversations that any of us on the planet should be having.
Well said. And 3 really wonderful points to bring us home today. Authenticity, knowing thyself, committing to actions, not just pledges, and benchmarking to really track progress. So, Anne, thank you so much for sharing Amex's experience with us today and really your learnings. James, thank you so much for introducing us to the 3 Ps and how we've, can be navigating them in this time of purpose. Both of you, this has been such a great conversation. So much more to be had. But really appreciate you both being here today. So thank you so much. I'm Megan Miller. This is the Provoke Media Podcast, and we're signing up. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Provoke Podcast, brought to you by Provoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.